So, first I'd like to talk about just meditation in general. And one of the, three really aspects that we need for a meditation practice are capacity, willingness, and know-how. Right? So capacity, well, you can kind of think of that as like rock climbing or maybe going to the gym. Right? If you go to the gym and you try to lift the 100-pound weights, you're not going to be able to right away, right? So you need to start with a 10-pound weight and then maybe a couple of weeks later go to the 15-pound weight and so forth. And so we start building more and more capacity. And that's what a sound meditation practice allows us to do by following the breath, by getting distracted and returning. That motion, getting distracted and returning, each time we get distracted and we come back, we're strengthening the muscle of awareness. We're building more and more capacity. So that really helps, that practice really helps our meditation mature and grow. And then there's willingness. Well, you all are here. That illustrates a certain amount of willingness, right? So that's taken care of. And today I'll be supplying the know-how like that. But there's many other resources. My website, which I already mentioned, suchsweetthunder.org. But there are many, many great teachers and websites and books out today that can supply some really wonderful know-how like that. So, the Buddha, arguably, probably one of the greatest meditation teachers that ever lived, I would say. He, in his first sermon, gave what's known as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Now, this has become, over the course of a couple of centuries, Buddhist orthodoxy. But due to recent scholarship, we know now that the Noble Truths, that phrase, Noble Truth, was never used in the original text. That was added later, probably as a way of allowing Buddhism to compete with Jainism and Hinduism in ancient India as a main religion. If a religion can't purport to have a truth, then it's not really going to hold any water, right? So probably the phrase Noble Truth was added much later. So I like to think of it as the four. I like to take out the Noble Truth because that takes out the dogma, right? You can just talk about these four tasks, these four practices that the Buddha left us with. And the first one is life contains dukkha, the Sanskrit word dukkha. Traditionally, the word dukkha is translated as suffering, but I'm going to expound on that a little later. That's a tricky translation. The second of the four is we suffer because of our emotional reaction to our stimulus, to life. That's what brings rise to our suffering. The third of the four was that we don't have to react emotionally. We can unplug those reactions, that we can free ourselves from our emotional reaction to life. That's some great relief in that, right? Yeah. Yeah. And the fourth of the four is marga, the path. And there are 8 branches. It's called the Eightfold Path. And that is really allowing us to cultivate a life which allows us to unplug from our emotional reactions, and a way of living life in which that unplugging becomes much easier, like that. So those are the four. And I'll just go through the Eightfold Path very quickly. It's complete understanding, complete intention, complete speech, complete action, complete livelihood, complete attention, complete concentration, and complete meditation. Now, complete is a very recent modern translation. It's typically translated as right speech, right action, right livelihood, and so forth. But that brings rise to this right versus wrong kind of duality, right? And the Buddha wasn't really interested in saying what is right and what is wrong. He was more interested in allowing his students to become mindful. So the more mindful we are with our actions, the more mindful we are with our speech, and so forth, that becomes a complete practice in itself. So that's why I use the word complete. So what does that mean to be mindful of our speech or our actions? Well, traditionally, and if going back to the orthodoxy again, right speech is thought to be speech that's kind, that's relevant, that's truthful, and so forth. They list these qualities. What I've found is that that creates a certain amount of repression, right? It gives us an ideal to try to live up to with our speech. And that isn't a spiritual practice at all, right? Living up to an ideal of somebody else's. So one very easy way to practice complete speech or mindful speech is listening to the sound of your voice while you talk. If you listen to the sound of your voice while you're talking, as if you're listening to somebody else speak, your speech will be relevant. It may not always be kind, because maybe kindness isn't appropriate for the present moment, right? But this puts you exactly into the present moment. And if you're a diplomat, maybe honest speech isn't the most appropriate speech, right? Maybe we, diplomats maybe need to bend a little bit. So, and the Buddha knew that. The Buddha knew that these 8 qualities, life isn't always black and white. It's many, many shades of gray. And so by bringing mindfulness to these 8 aspects of life, rather than prescribing a certain behavior, this allows us to be more in tune with the present moment, rather than trying to live up to a certain ideal. Thanks for coming. Glad you made it. I'm sorry we left you stranded. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So, back to the first of the 4, dukkha. Now, I mentioned that this is a bit of a problematic translation, right? The Sanskrit word dukkha, which is typically translated as suffering. Well, luckily, during this sermon that the Buddha was giving, one of his disciples asked the Buddha, "Buddha, what do you mean by dukkha?" And the Buddha responded to that question. He said, well, dukkha is birth, dukkha is sickness, dukkha is aging, dukkha is death, dukkha is not getting what one wants, dukkha is getting what one doesn't want, dukkha is being separated from those who are dear, and dukkha is being near those who aren't dear. So, really, when it's read like that, dukkha is life, right? And, birth, that's life. Aging, that's also life. Not getting what one wants, well, that's life, right? Getting what one doesn't want, we can look at the weather and know that that's part of life too, right? So really the first of the 4 is a call to embrace life. It's really that carrying call to embrace the present moment as fully as possible. Like that. So once we've embraced dukkha, or said yes to dukkha, then we move on to the second of the 4. And this doesn't happen like in stages, it's actually happening all the time, and I'll go through an example of that in a moment. So the second of the 4 is we see the arising of our emotion, or we have an emotional reaction. We see this arising, samudaya, that's known in Sanskrit. So we have this emotional response to the present moment. Now, typically what happens is we're going through our day, something triggers us, that dukkha arises, and we cling to it. And it becomes our world. It becomes who we are. We identify with that reaction immediately. And that's what brings us to our suffering. But the Buddha said we don't have to do that. We can allow that to go. So in meditation, we learn to rest, very deeply resting. And then we see the emotional reaction come up. We see the dukkha arise. And then we want to grasp onto it. In meditation might be something simple like an itch or an ache or maybe an irritating thought that keeps coming up. And we grasp onto it like that. And then that thought takes us away, or we knee-jerk reaction, scratch the itch, or we move our leg or whatever to adjust. So we flee from that. But if we can rest in that present moment, what happens is that emotional reaction arises and it subsides. And we don't have to do anything. There's no effort. And then another dukkha will arise, passes through our awareness, and subsides like that. So there's no effort, there's no pushing away. There's no clinging either. Remember, dukkha is also getting what one wants, right? So sometimes something pleasant will arise in the meditation. Oh, that's that was a wonderful memory. Cling to it, rest, allow that to go. So we don't need to move at all. It's a complete resting practice. Now the third of the four is the ceasing, is allowing that arc to happen. Now when that happens, when we can rest deeply like that, allow this irritation or ache or attraction, whatever it is, to arise and pass, that is a wonderful feeling, a wonderful resting quality that we're cultivating, and it feels good. And the Buddha said, get to know what that feels like. Embrace that feeling, because that's nirvana. Nirvana isn't some far-off heavenly state or land that we're trying to get to. But nirvana actually is now. If we can see our life that way, if we can recognize that we don't need to suffer in this way, that's living life through nirvana. And then when we embrace what that feels like, that allows us to start to cultivate a life which brings that, because it is so nice, which brings more of that. We want more of that. We see that we're helping ourselves not suffer, and as a result of that, we're helping others not suffer around us. And so we start to want to cultivate a life which allows us to do more of this, and that leads us to the Eightfold Path. Like that. Any questions so far?
Chris, would you say the essence of the cause of dukkha is resistance to what is?
The cause of suffering?
Yeah.
Yes. Resistance, aversion, or clinging to brings us our suffering. And also indifference. Attraction, aversion, and indifference. That's known as the three poisons in Buddhism.
Could you say that again?
Attraction, aversion, and indifference. Now, a lot of people find indifference to be tricky, but indifference is actually what gives rise to prejudice. And so you think about the human condition now as a world culture, you can see the type of suffering that indifference is bringing. So indifference is very important. It's a little bit harder to recognize. But if you find that you're bored during a meditation practice, indifference gives rise to boredom. So that's one very good way to know that if you're feeling indifferent to the meditation practice that you're in, is that if you feel like a sense of boredom arise. Now what happens, and we talked about this earlier, if that happens, if you feel like, oh, I'd really rather be doing something else, or that type of boredom arises, there's a quality there, a feeling in the body. Look at that feeling look directly at it. And what you'll find is that actually, once you've done that, the boredom tends to dissolve, and it gives rise to equanimity. Boredom, indifference and equanimity are related in that way. And if you feel equanimous, but that equanimity decays, it decays back into boredom. So it's a cycle there, like that. But if you can, look at the boredom, separate yourself from the boredom, and look at the feeling of being bored, you'll see that it gives rise to equanimity. So it's a really wonderful practice in itself.
Boredom can be very interesting if you look at it.
Yes, as all of our emotions
Yeah.
can be. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
I remember experiencing that when I started meditation. I found myself bored and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And I started looking at it carefully, and it went.
Yeah.
It's never really come back. I've had other problems, but not that one.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, once you're interested in your boredom,
Yeah.
then your boredom is gone. So that's really, yeah. Good. So this is what we do in the silence of meditation, moment to moment. While we're in the meditation practice, and I'll be guiding some of that later, you'll notice, this chair really hurts my butt, or, oh, I should have gone to the bathroom before we started, or, oh, I can't wait to eat those fish and chips tonight, I love those fish and chips. All of those thoughts, every thought is laced with either attraction, aversion, or indifference. And so just by resting, not following the thoughts, sounds dead easy, but it's probably the hardest thing in the world to do, right? Resting in the body, allowing the mind and heart to rest. And I always see it as an arc. The feeling arises, the feeling gives rise to a thought. The thought comes, and if I'm resting, it just goes like that. And there's a satisfaction there at the end of the third, the ceasing, this real deep satisfaction. And that gives me the confidence to do it again. I was on a retreat where we did 90-minute sittings. I don't recommend that. I do multiple hours in a day, but I take breaks. Right now I'm on a framework where I'll do 45-minute sittings and take 15-minute breaks. But if you're starting a practice, don't do anything that extreme. Yeah, and other people here have heard me talk about this before, but really starting a practice, I think it requires a gentle touch, you know. Always work, well, at least in the first week or two, find an amount of time that's comfortable. It could be 5 minutes, it could be 7 minutes, doesn't matter. But as long as it's an amount of time you don't feel like it's a chore, that's really important. Because what happens then is that you start to feel that arc, and you start to feel the good feeling, and you start to want more of that. And so very organically, usually, after a month or two of doing maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes, all of a sudden the clock is moving up to 12 minutes, you know, and then maybe after a month of that, you're moving it up to 15 minutes. It can be a very gradual process. You don't have to rush into doing an hour sitting every day. You know, I don't recommend that actually, because I think the desire for the practice is really important. So if you start with bite-sized chunks, it's good to, after the week 1 or 2, try to find the edge where you're sitting for maybe 10 minutes, and towards the 9th minute you're like, oh, I want to get up and do something else. Once that thought happens, the first time that happens, consider it a thought, let it go, come back to the practice. The second time that happens, you're done. It's time to do something else. Like that. You don't want to allow the practice to get frustrating. That's important. And if you miss a couple of days too, that's really, consider that another thought. Let that go and start back again.
what is the trick then to emptying your mind of all the everyday things?
I'm going to get into all the tricks when we do the guided part. That's a good lead-in. I'll start. Is everyone okay? We can do a meditation and then take a break?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Set my timer here. So, some of you have been with me before, and this will be very familiar to you. This is the ground stage of this meditation practice. Now, this practice is what I've done is taken. It's really two meditation practices, two traditional meditation practices combined. One is a practice that's really designed to help the body rest, and the other practice is designed to help us look into the mind. I've combined them together because I think it makes a very effective practice that way. I've gotten some great results with it. So what we do is we start by acknowledging the present moment, feeling sensations that we have with us in the present moment. And we start by bringing our awareness and attention to the nose, feeling the air entering the nose and leaving the nose. And then we add more sensations. We add the sensations of the air touching the back of the throat, sensations of the lungs expanding and contracting, the back moving with the breath and the abdomen, and so forth. So it's this experience of awareness expanding, always growing larger, starting small with the nose and then adding more and more sensations throughout the body. Like that. And then we'll rest with the breath just for a few moments. And then we go through the body. We do what's called body scanning. We start from the top of the head and we scan all the way to the bottoms of the feet, always adding more and more sensations like that. So by the end of that portion of the meditation, ideally, we'll be able to experience the entire breathing process and the entire body at the same time. Like that. And after we've done the breath and body, I'll guide our awareness to experience the sounds and the silence of the present moment, the aural field, like that. Now that's quite a bit of sensory experience to comprehend all at the same time, right? The sensations of the breath and the body and the sounds and silence. Inevitably, what tends to happen is our awareness wants to focus or collapse down on a particular sound or sensation, like that. I like to use the example of my shoulder because sometimes I get a sore shoulder. And so if that soreness arises, my awareness right down, and that's all I am. Remember that arc, right? That soreness arises and then, and that happens because pain is so vivid and intense that it tends to take us away like that. In any case, my awareness is collapsed down here. If that happens during your practice, allow your awareness to expand out from what you're focused on, to include all of the sensations wherever we are in the practice, like that. That motion of coming out from if it's an itch or an ache or irritation, whatever, coming out from that point is important because what it'll do, it'll allow your awareness to recognize that, the skin around that itch isn't itchy, or the muscle around that ache doesn't hurt. That's rather comfortable. And so it almost alleviates whatever you're focused on, the irritation that you're focused on, just by that motion, which is nice. If an irritation does arise and you feel like it's pretty intense and you want to move or scratch the itch or whatnot, the traditional teaching is not to move. Now, that's a bit strict, I know. So what I recommend is that if there is an irritation distracting you during a meditation practice, ask yourself the question, can I rest with this? when you pose the question, can I rest with this? Well, oftentimes I've found that the muscle ache tends to go just by asking that question. It allows me to find a deeper form of resting in which I can rest with that irritation. But if the answer is no, and you need to scratch the itch or you need to move, that's fine. But now what you've done is you've brought mindfulness to that decision, right? And now it's not a knee-jerk reaction. Now you've actually brought an awareness to that emotion. And that's really the idea of the practice, is to bring mindfulness to all of our decisions. So now you've brought mindfulness to that decision of pushing away irritation and grasping at pleasure. That's really what we're doing when that happens. We're pushing away aversion and grasping towards attraction, like that, when we're moving away from discomfort towards comfort. And the reason why it's important to bring mindfulness to that is that motion is the root of all addiction, right there, right? Not being able to embrace the present moment fully, not being able to embrace dukkha. So we have to move away, but now we've brought an awareness to that decision. That's very important. Okay. So I just want to give a little example of, yeah, sure. Are you coming back?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm losing everyone already. I just want to give a little example of feeling the inside of the body. Because oftentimes when people do body scanning, we tend to visualize our body. That's not what we want to do here. When we visualize the body, our body remains in the conceptual mind. But what we're trying to do is actually reclaim the body from our conceptual mind, to be able to feel the inside of the body, the entire body, like that. So if you just put your arms out in front of you, yeah, Frankenstein pose I call it, and just let the wrists, let the hands hang at the end of the wrists. And if you can, don't look at the hands, but allow your gaze to be somewhere else. And if you close your eyes, that's fine, but don't visualize the hands in your mind's eye if you're closing your eyes. Just feel the hands hanging at the end of the wrist. You might feel just the pull of the hands in gravity, or perhaps a warm or a cool sensation. But if you can just feel your hands there as they exist. Okay, put your arms down. So is everybody able to, if you just know that they're existing there, you're feeling the inside of the body. So that's the type of awareness we're going to bring through the entire body, like that. If you find during the body scanning practice that you are visualizing your body, you're seeing your body in your mind's eye, just consider that a thought. And that's a good segue into what to do with thoughts. So how to keep the mind silent. Well, there's a technique that I really like to use and that I teach. I found it very effective. And that is, whenever you notice your mind is thinking, say the word thinking to yourself. And what that does is that labels the thinking process. It allows you to step outside or away from the thoughts, like that. And once that's done, take that example of the arc again. Whatever it is that arises, attraction, aversion, indifference, it's arising. We grasp onto it, we're following the thought. At that point, once you recognize it, say thinking, and you'll be able to rest back like that. Once that happens, the thought tends to go rather quickly on its own. Again, there's no effort. You don't have to push the thoughts. You don't want to cling to the thoughts either. But just allow the thought to go. So you're thinking and allow the thought to go. No effort, really, in that motion. I know I make it sound easy again by saying it's effortless, but it might come, I've had people tell me that it's like a machine gun, thinking, so many thoughts. If that happens, don't allow that to be discouraging. That's actually the process of meditation. The dukkha arising, we cling to it, and letting it go. That's the process of meditation. Now each time we recognize we're distracted, we say thinking, it's like lifting a weight. You're strengthening the muscle of awareness. It goes back to that capacity that we were talking about. It's every time you get distracted, you say thinking, the thought goes, you return to the breath or the body, like that. You've put a little more money in the capacity bank account. So after a few years, you can buy enlightenment. Pardon the analogy. But yeah, so that's that motion of getting distracted, returning, getting distracted, returning. That's the practice of meditation. If you could sit here for 35 minutes and not have any thoughts, there'd be no reason for you to be here. So don't let the thoughts get discouraging. It's normal to have a lot of thoughts. Okay. Pause this. Don't feel inhibited by the recording, because many times people don't want to ask questions when I record, but do know that there are probably people, many people who will see this who might have similar questions to your own, or people in the room actually who might have similar questions to your own. So during a Q&A, I tend to ask that you look at it as a form of generosity. Asking a question is a form of generosity. So don't feel shy to ask questions, please.
Should the breathing be deep? Saying in through the nose and then to the lungs and to the abdomen. It seems like there's 3 chambers, then deeper. But that's not relaxing. Shallow breathing I find more relaxing, and I'm a bit confused as to whether shallow breathing is enough.
Sure. Yeah, just breathe as you would normally. What I have found, what tends to happen when people practice this type of practice for some time, the breath naturally tends to get deeper on its own. But in this practice, there's no right or wrong way of breathing. We're just really experiencing the breath as it happens. So we don't want to try to control the breathing at all. Yeah.
I think it's sinus problems with allergies, etc. And so deep breathing through my nose isn't easy.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. No, it's fine to breathe shallow for this practice. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. Just to recognize what's there and be in the experience of what's there.
I had an interesting experience at one point. I'm shaking, as you can probably tell from the croaky voice, I'm shaking off a bit of a throat bug. And at one point there was almost an agonising sense of needing to cough, and intense sensation that normally, if I wasn't meditating, I'd have had some water and coughed loudly. But I suppose part of it's embarrassment, not wanting to send a fusillade of coughs throughout the room. But I thought, okay, it's an opportunity just to go deeply into the sensation. And I found if I could really experience it totally, really concentrate on that, but also trying to broaden it out. I kept trying to do that because I think you must have picked it up at one point, because you commented just after I was doing that, if it collapses down, do broaden it out. So that was well timed, well tuned in. It did kind of work itself through. So I suppose what meditation like this shows us is we have a choice. Normally things that we would just be in reactivity. We can just let it experience, and sometimes that could be, sometimes it is appropriate to do some action of some kind, but it gives us a choice.
Yes, absolutely, and that's the arc that I was referring to before we started. Feeling the irritation, acknowledging the irritation, we automatically collapse onto it briefly, more often than not. But then you can use thinking or just recognize that it is just a sensation. Allow it to go, and then it goes on its own. Like that. Yeah. There's no irritation or ache or pain or itch that lasts a lifetime. As difficult as broken bones can be and really intense pain, we know that it arises and it passes, and so it subsides. And there's great relief in that, recognizing that arc.
There was also a slight bonus in that I was feeling quite sleepy for the first part of meditation. But what with all the energy with that, I didn't have any problem with sleepiness for the rest of the meditation.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So it did energize me.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I know my voice tends to put people to sleep sometimes. I've had complaints. So, anybody have that experience? A little nodding?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To begin with, your voice is so relaxing. I kind of realized I was asleep. But when I woke up, when I came back to myself, I was very relaxed. And as I concentrated on each part of the body, I felt, I've had that before, I can't feel the body anymore. So then it was, each part became tingling, and then it did not exist anymore. So that's quite useful. So by the time you asked us to just do the breathing, I felt it was quite easy, because there's no more body. It wasn't that. Is that the normal thing, when you don't feel your body anymore?
I think I've had people tell me that before. Different sensations for different people. I think it's kind of an individual thing. Some people get warmth, particularly in the hands and feet or the top of the head. My whole body tends to heat up whenever I meditate. I get that. Yeah, you too. And it's because that body scanning in particular, it touches into the subtle energies of the body, the same energies that are activated in acupuncture or Tai Chi or Qigong, the healing energies of the body. It actually, it's been shown that this type of practice stimulates the immune system. It's just one of the many benefits. So as we touch in with the subtle energies of the body, different sensations can arise. It's different for different people. Yeah. Sometimes also people get visualizations from that same thing, colors. Sometimes if the eyes are closed, colors will come up. Yeah, so that's the same, from a result from the same process, touching into the subtle energies of the body.
If you get images coming, I had the image of this Buddhist statue or something, I decided to not to look at that. I thought, what do you do with that? Do you just avoid it? Or?
Well, consider it a thought, and say thinking, and see if that works to allow it to go. We don't want to, I try not to use words like avoid or push away, because it implies more effort than is really required. The resting quality of this practice is really so important. So whenever we're resting, if we're actually avoiding something or trying to push something away, then we're no longer at rest. So that resting quality is really important. So, yeah.
What if a thought is persistent, and so you stay thinking and it doesn't subside? Have you got any tricks of?
Well, there's a couple of things that points to if the thought, it's one thought that kept reoccurring, or that if there's an emotional quality to that thought, it might be something that needs to be processed. That happens often during this type of practice, where emotional thoughts will arise, and it's because we haven't processed those emotions yet. So when I'm working with people, I set aside a specific practice or two or a week or however long to help process that, and then we continue. But if it's like sometimes this is pretty common, list making. I don't know if that was the type of thought, but if you're making lists, or if you have a habit of making lists, and that sometimes comes up during meditation. I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do that. If it's that type of thing, I recommend setting aside a certain amount of time or a certain time during the week or during the day to make the lists. And then you know that in the meditation, if that list making happens, you can say, oh, there's time for that. I don't need to do that now. You know, that I can deal with that later. Or also, you can use a similar concept